She left him in a corridor, the baby wailing at his chest, and walked away as if someone had asked her to step out for a minute and never returned. 10 years later, when she finally walked back into his life, she could not move. She froze at the sight of him, not for the money he might have gained, but because what he had become was a life she once chose to reject. The day it happened, rain was falling in soft sheets, the kind that blurs faces and muffles voices. Jamal Harris had the baby bundled against his jacket, one arm full of a pink blanket that had been washed so many times the fabric had the familiar softness of survival. He'd been at the event because Vanessa, the woman he thought he would build a life with, had asked him to come. That morning she had kissed the baby's forehead and told him to wait in the hall. There would be people, she said, people he needed to meet, people who could help. He believed her. People in that hall moved like they had been trained not to see him. Men in tailored suits parted with practiced disengagement. Women with polished purses pretended the crying meant nothing. A chandelier shivered above them. The room smelled faintly of lacquer and lilies. Jamal felt every eye as something cold and precise. He was used to being overlooked. Work kept him honest and small checks kept the apartment lights on. But there is a particular kind of humiliation that comes when someone you love becomes part of the machinery that discards you. Vanessa's mother, Elaine Whitmore, stood by a cluster of guests and said something that could have been a joke if not for the way her lips tightened afterwards. Jamal heard it anyway, like a stone dropped into water. How did she ever think that would last? He glanced down at the baby and tightened his grip. The infant's face was red from crying. The sound cut through the murmurs like a raw chord. Vanessa appeared for one last second at the edge of the corridor. Her eyes met his, not with apology, but with the practiced expression of someone who had rehearsed a whole new life. She didn't reach for him. She did not come closer to steady the baby or say a single caring word. She turned, moved through the people, and was swallowed by the doors that led to the bright rooms and quiet lives she had chosen. A hand lifted to the small of her back in a familiar gesture Jamal did not recognize. He could see the outline of a man in a dark suit guiding her onward. One of the Whitmore sons, perhaps. Jamal was left to the rain and the corridor's echo. It was over in minutes, but it lodged like a stone. He stood on wet floors until the baby's sobs slowed to hiccups, until someone from the building staff, a janitor who had always treated him with a nod of sympathy, brought him a plastic cup of lukewarm coffee and a paper towel. Jamal folded himself against a pillar and tried to make sense of the wordless question that swelled in his chest. How had the person who promised a life instead turned toward a family that treated him as an inconvenience? He had survived poverty long enough to know what being unseen felt like. Jamal worked 2 jobs. Nights at the municipal transport yard clearing buses, mornings stocking shelves at a corner grocer. He attended community college on nights he wasn't scheduled to work, textbooks folded into the same bag that carried diapers. When Arthur Green, the retired maintenance foreman who lived 2 doors down, left Jamal an old toolbox and a stack of notebooks filled with scribbled numbers and dates. Start small, let time do the heavy lifting, Arthur had said. Jamal thought of it as kindness, not prophecy. Arthur had been a quiet man who liked his coffee black and his savings in a battered shoebox. He taught Jamal how to mend, how to live below means, how to read balance sheets the way other men read a newspaper. When Jamal met Vanessa at an evening class, she seemed like a door to the rest of the world. She was quick with a laugh, the sort of woman who could turn criticism into a joke and make others lift their guard. Their first months together were ordinary miracles. Cramped apartments, shared pots of rice, a thrifted stroller that rocked the baby to sleep. She said she loved him. She said they would make it. And for a while they did. Then, the Whitmores happened. Vanessa started to speak of things that had not been hers before. Invitations, the right shade of lipstick for gallery openings, the etiquette of a life without late-night shifts. Jamal did not begrudge her the change. He wanted her to have whatever she needed. But there was a point when that wanting turned into an ache marked by small exclusions. The subtle way she stopped bringing him to family events, the way she answered his texts later, the way her phone calls ended abruptly when anyone else came in the room. After the corridor incident, Jamal remembered how Arthur once told him while they bent over a squeaking engine, that the loudest judgments usually came from people who had the most to lose by being known. Jamal had not been able to reconcile how a woman who had promised to stand by him could so neatly step into a life that treated his very presence as an embarrassment. He rocked the baby and watched the rain complicate the world. He let himself bend small, as if to fit into a life that had no room for him. 3 weeks later, Jamal found himself in a mahogany-paneled room whose smell smelled like polished regrets. The funeral for Arthur Green had been small, held on a Tuesday when the streets were less busy. The Whitmores were not only there, it felt as if they were there to perform. Vanessa had come too, in a coat that swallowed her frame and a face that tried for neutrality. Jamal, in a plain sweater and thread-worn shoes, sat at the edge of a polished table while the family occupied the center. He felt the weight of 1,000 invisible judgments pressing down like humidity. Samuel Price, the estate attorney, was a thin man with a voice practiced for formalities. He read the will aloud slowly, and the room grew still in the way people quiet a radio when they don't want to miss a single word. For Jamal, the words felt both distant and delivered straight into his chest. Arthur had left all property, investments and savings to Jamal Harris. A trust would hold the assets, Samuel explained, to be administered for Jamal's benefit and for the benefit of programs Arthur wanted to support. Jamal's name was pronounced by people who had not called him so when he needed them. There was a rustle like a collective intake of breath. Vanessa's hands tightened into small fists in her coat pockets. Elaine Whitmore's mouth formed a thin line. The Whitmore patriarch, Harlan, blinked as if waking from a performance. Derek, the eldest son with the practiced smile, laughed in a way that tried too hard and came out sharp. "You know," Samuel continued, eyes flicking to the Whitmores with a practiced impartiality. Mr. Green also attached specific conditions to parts of the estate. He left items of symbolic value to several individuals here, very small amounts, to be distributed as reminders of his intentions. He read those parts without comment. An old fountain pen to Elaine, a pair of cufflinks to Harlan, a $1 to the eldest grandson, with a note about the cost of courtesy. The room shifted. A small, almost theatrical sting threaded through the murmuring. Vanessa looked as if she had been slapped. "This has to be contested," whispered someone at her side. Anger mixed with embarrassment in her voice. Jamal watched it like a distant storm. The Whitmores, who had never found Jamal's presence more than mildly inconvenient, suddenly found themselves the subjects of a roomful of polite curiosity. Then Samuel did something none of them expected. "Mr. Green left in my custody, recordings and documents," he said, his voice careful. He directed that Mr. Harris could review them before making a decision about how best to proceed. In Mr. Green's words, he wanted the truth known before any final steps were taken. On the table, Samuel placed a slim, sealed envelope stamped with a notary's mark, and the name Jamal Harris written in a hand that trembled just a hair. The Whitmores bristled with impatience. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed. "What are these?" Harlan demanded. "We have rights to contest." "You may," Samuel interrupted, "but Mr. Green's directions are clear." He wanted Mr. Harris to decide with full knowledge whether to engage with anyone connected to his past. He preferred no hasty actions. The lawyer's neutral tone was a chord properly tuned. He left no room for spectacle, only procedure. Jamal looked at the envelope as if it might burn his fingers. He thought of the corridor again, the rain, the baby's cries. He thought of Arthur's old hands showing him how to tighten a bolt, how to count pennies into a jar for a future jarred impatience. He took the envelope home. The apartment door closed behind him like a book. The baby was asleep in a cracked cradle on which someone had stitched a small sun. Jamal set the envelope on the kitchen table, its weight suddenly heavy with possibility. He paced the narrow room, counting the minutes, and then he sat down and slit the seal. Inside were flash drives, a sheaf of faded letters, and a small note in Arthur's handwriting. "Listen all the way through. Let what they say meet what you know your life to be. Then decide." Jamal put a flash drive into his old laptop. The screen glowed with a blue honesty that felt like a confession lamp. The first file bore the label 2013-2017 Conversations. Jamal's thumb hovered, then pressed play. A voice filled the room, Vanessa's, unmistakable because she had once said his name softly in the dark as if it were a secret. But here, light caught her words differently. She laughed about the way Jamal dressed, imitating him with that same practiced edge that used to be affection veiled as amusement. Another voice joined, Elaine's, crisp and clinical, making remarks about suitability and keeping appearances. A third voice, Derek's, added a coarse joke about Jamal's job, the kind that lands like a stone and stays. Listening, Jamal felt them rearrange the past with a cruelty he had only sensed in fragments. There were conversations about how to manage Vanessa's relationship, suggestions that she might be brilliant to find someone of better prospects, that the family should nudge her into a different crowd. The audio was a slow unspooling of many small humiliations. The nights Richard had said, "He's cute in a do-gooder way." The time they joked about keeping him on a leash for appearances. Under each remark was the same assumption. Jamal would be an inconvenience to be tolerated, not a person to be loved. There were also quieter recordings, ones that cut the deep into Jamal's chest. In one, Vanessa's voice trembled with a kind of practiced sorrow as she told Elaine she was worried about messing up her chances at a good life. In another, someone, perhaps Vanessa herself, perhaps another, suggested that the baby would be easier to manage if Jamal took responsibility for the mundane grit of fatherhood while Vanessa stepped into opportunities. Words like opportunity and advance were used as if Jamal's sacrifices were part of a plan, not a life. By the time he reached the fifth file, Jamal was no longer merely hearing them. He was standing in the corridor again, the coffee gone cold in the janitor's plastic cup. He remembered Vanessa's face as she left, and so many small moments that suddenly fit together like a puzzle revealing the whole picture. The missed calls answered later with distance, the absenteeism from family dinners, the nights she insisted he stay home for the baby, so she could attend an event with a smile ready. Anger rose like heat. It was bitter and immediate. He imagined marching back to the mahogany room, standing up and naming every word that had been thrown at him, every laugh that had been turned into a minor weapon. He pictured the Whitmore's faces when the recordings were played to a world that understood how cruelty wears the mask of civility. But another voice, Arthur's, somehow present in a remembered phrase, tempered that impulse. "You can make them pay, or you can make the world better," Arthur had once said in a tone that was both warning and prayer. "One costs you what you'll forget to keep. The other costs you from what you'll give along the way." Jamal realized that any public spectacle could feed their appetite for dominance. He thought of his child's laugh, gritty with the small joy of a life not yet taught to mirror the world's disdain. He thought of the nights reading to the baby from tattered picture books under the scuffed lamplight. He did not want to spend his life proving to them that they were wrong. He felt suddenly and truly, to build something that outlasted them. Still, the recordings were a wound. They were also evidence. They suggested, in a way that Samuel had warned could be pursued, that the Whitmores had engaged in behavior intended to hamper Jamal's standing, perhaps even to obscure financial dealings that favored their image over truth. There were offhand references in a couple of files to assets being kept in the family, and talk of shelving certain expenditures through shell corporations, phrases that made Jamal's stomach lurch. He did not know what any of it legally meant, only that what had felt like humiliation had been planned in a way that was far from accidental. He called Samuel the next morning and arranged to meet. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and legal pads. Samuel explained, in careful neutral sentences, what a trust could do, how a conditional distribution might work, and how pursuing allegations of financial misconduct would require evidence beyond audio and could trigger an investigation. "Allegations will need to be corroborated," Samuel said. "There are safe ways to proceed that protect you and the child. There are also more public ways." His tone did not judge. He simply laid out options like tools, each heavy with consequence. Jamal thought of all the nights he had settled for a small life because it was reliable. He thought of the trust Arthur had created, the savings jammed into jars and then grown into something larger through patience. He thought of the baby's future: diapers, school books, a place to sleep that never thawed into instability. The money felt different when it was a means to stop nights of worry and a way to create more than a single life story. It felt like an open door. He asked Samuel whether Arthur had left instructions about the use of the funds. Yes, Samuel replied. Mr. Green was very clear. He wanted significant portions used to support young parents, education, and community programs. He also wanted Mr. Harris to have autonomy for his own life. He believed in reinvesting in places like this one, not for spectacle, but to help people live without being made invisible. Jamal's throat tightened. The idea of using wealth as some public display made him uneasy. The idea of using it to open a center for working parents, to make sure a child like his could find affordable childcare and tutoring, felt right in a way that made his chest expand. For a moment he saw, as if in a window, a tutoring center painted the color of a warm afternoon, students hunched in focus, a mother picking up a child with the ease of someone not scraping for every hour. But then there was the other side, proof and retribution. There were people out there, he realized, who had been harmed by the same behavior that had hurt him, folks whose small vulnerabilities had been exploited by wealth. Maybe the recordings were the first thread to pull. Maybe bringing them into the light would unearth a pattern worth exposing. An investigation might protect others. Yet it would also invite the Whitmore's lawyers, their public statements, their preserved reputations. It would turn his life into a spectacle for which the baby might pay the price. Jamal cradled the infant in the small afternoon light, the child's breath a soft punctuation against his chest. He placed the flash drive back into its envelope and laid it gently on the table as if it were nothing more than a folded note. The baby slept. Outside, the city moved with its indifferent momentum. He did not decide then. He did not yet choose the path that would tilt his life forever. He only allowed himself to feel the dual pull, a righteous desire for accountability and a deeper hunger to build something that would not be centered on retribution. He thought of Arthur's mantra about letting time do the heavy lifting. Perhaps, he thought, the right step was neither spectacle nor silence but something in between. To secure the safety for his child first, to honor Arthur's directives to create spaces for others, and to let investigations follow if there was a way to pursue them without unraveling the fragile new world he could make. Later that night he pressed play on the first of the unearthed files again, letting Vanessa's voice wash over him, letting the hurt be what it was. There was also a different audio, recorded months before Arthur died, of the old man's own voice, steady, pragmatic, kind. "If they can be taught to see you," Arthur said, "teach them by giving them no reason to break what you build. Build a place they cannot buy and cannot mock. If this story speaks to you, if you believe people who choose dignity over revenge deserve as much attention as the flashy headlines, like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." Days turned into a small plan. Jamal signed the acknowledgement form to activate the initial distribution for immediate needs, a modest apartment that would no longer be subject to the week-by-week rent anxiety, a savings cushion for the baby's medical care, and some seed money for a grassroots tutoring pilot Arthur had sketched in one of his notebooks. Samuel filed the paperwork with the trust, each signature a small, precise act that felt like a turning of a key. But the envelope of recordings sat like an unlit fuse on the kitchen table. Jamal knew it could be lit. He also knew that the light could burn the house down. When he finally opened more of the files, the audio revealed a layering of conversations, some banal, some malicious. In a clip from a restaurant, two men laughed about an expense that had been hidden in the accounts, referring to a property handled by a third party. In a separate file, a woman's voice, softer this time, hinted at the use of charitable donations as a way to clean appearances. The pieces were thin, the language veiled, but the pattern was visible to anyone looking for it. Jamal took photocopies of the most damaging portions and put them into a manila folder. He did not share them with anyone yet. He felt as if the folder had the weight of a possible future, prosecutions, investigations, reputational collapses, but also the hardness of a public fight that might be endless. The folder burned a little hole in his bag each time he moved, a private ember. At night he watched his child sleep and pictured a tutoring room filled with faces like his own. Kids with elbows scarred by late work, parents who could not afford after-school help, students who needed someone to say, plainly, that they mattered. He imagined the building in his neighborhood where rents were not a trap, and where a parent could leave a child without fear of that child's life being rearranged by hunger. So he began quietly to put the first pieces into place. He reached out to Ms. Rosa at the community center, a woman who ran an after-school program, and knew how to stretch every dollar into a dozen small miracles. He met with a retired teacher named Daniel Boone, a large man with a gentleness that made children quick to trust him, and asked if he would lead the tutoring pilot. He wrote checks that did not dazzle but that solved immediate problems. A week's childcare for a single mother, a bus pass for a student who might otherwise miss classes, art supplies for a program that could not quite find room in its budget. People noticed, but not in the magazines Vanessa had once checked for parties. They noticed in small ways. A teacher sending an email of thanks, a mother crying in the doorway because she could afford a night of rest. Jamal kept his profile low. He did not purchase a glossy suit or a watch that flashed money. He wore what he had, and his quiet became a new kind of statement. Still, the recordings waited. The Whitmores were not yet a storm, but they smelled a shift. They made motions that were predictable. Phone calls to mutual acquaintances, a lawyer's note sent to Samuel that read more like intimidation than inquiry. There were thinly veiled social media posts about respecting privacy in times of mourning, an attempt to define the narrative before people could ask questions. Jamal did not respond to the noise. He focused on the work. Then one morning, while Jamal was organizing donated books in a small rented room set aside for the pilot program, Vanessa walked into the doorway. She had the same face that had left him in a corridor years before, but smaller somehow, as if the years had narrowed possibilities instead of broadening them. Her eyes found his across the room, and for a second she stopped in place. The air between them was heavy with a history neither of them could erase. She did not cross the threshold. She stood in the doorway like someone who had come to measure the distance between then and now. Around her, children worked on math problems at small tables. A teacher nodded at Jamal in respect. The bulletin board behind him was crowded with flyers for classes and support groups. There was noise, life, the unglamorous electricity of people rebuilding themselves. Vanessa's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her face had the expression of someone seeing a mirror of a life she might have had. For a long minute she could not move. Jamal did not rush forward. He was not the same man who had waited in the corridor, stunned and pleading. He had learned to measure his steps. The child at his side, the baby who had once worn a pink blanket that smelled of laundry and late-night bottles, now tugged at his hand and looked up, trusting. Jamal met Vanessa's eyes, and in that look there was no triumph, only a steadiness that had been bought with sleepless work and deliberate kindness. Her silence stretched into a question. She had come perhaps to ask or to apologize or to reclaim what she had left. He could not be sure. What he was sure of was what he had become, a man who could choose how to answer. He turned to the table where the manila folder lay, the one holding the recordings and the notes that could detonate reputations. He could have reached for it and thrown it across the room. He could have called a press conference. He could have let the world watch as the Whitmores were exposed and as Vanessa tried to explain how. Once, she had looked the other way. Instead, he folded his hands in his lap and watched the children. A little boy raised his pencil triumphantly at a problem solved. A girl laughed at the crack of a joke. The room was messy and beloved and practical. Jamal allowed himself to be present to that small miracle. Vanessa's breath made a tiny sound. The old corridor had become a room where children solved math problems, and a man who had once been invisible was now, inconveniently for some, indispensable. She stood there, frozen, as if the very memory of what she had chosen and what she had left were meeting across the threshold. He had a choice. He could turn the folder over to Samuel and set in motion a public unraveling. He could use the recordings as leverage, force apologies, demand restitution in ways that would make headlines. Or he could, perhaps, take the quieter path Arthur had suggested. secure safety for himself and his child, build programs that outlasted petty cruelty, and let the legal threads be pulled in a way that did not make vengeance the point. The first part of his answer came from the way he simply stood and walked across the room to the little bookshelf, picked a battered picture book, and began to read aloud. Children stopped their work, heads cocked, listening to a voice that was steady and true. Vanessa watched him use the wealth Arthur had left not as a stage for revenge, but as a scaffold for other people's lives. She did not move for a long time. The moment held, and in that hold there was something like judgment and something like repentance, both heavy on her shoulders. Jamal read on. The baby at his feet reached out and clutched his sleeve. Out in the street the world continued, unaware of the small revolution unfolding in a cramped room lit by the sun that finally decided to come out after a week of rain. At the end of the afternoon, Jamal returned the manila folder to the drawer where he had kept it. He had not decided to pull the trigger. He had not decided to forgive. He had decided, for now, to build. He had also decided to keep the recordings safe, in case the world needed to know the truth for reasons that had nothing to do with his pride, and everything to do with justice for those who might follow. When Vanessa finally left, she did not look back. The doorway closed behind her with a sound that felt like a full stop and an ellipsis at once. Jamal watched the place where she had stood until the light shifted, and the room returned to its ordinary noises, pencils dragging, low talk, the rustle of pages. He returned to writing the modest grant proposal Arthur's notes suggested, thinking of a child years from now who might be able to step into a classroom without the shame that had once shadowed his own life. He had chosen a direction, though not the ultimate one. The recordings were still there, and the manila folder still smelled faintly of the paper in which it was wrapped. The Whitmores, he knew, would not vanish. But there was work to do, and the first blocks were in place. He had bought a place that would now be his address, not just his stopgap. He had given money to an after-school program that would lift a few dozen lives at first, and he hoped, many more with steady tending. Outside, night fell, and the sound of rain returned to the roof. Inside, Jamal made a small dinner, fed the child, and checked the locks. He did not sleep immediately. He sat by the window and watched a city of lights breathe. He let the recordings hum in the back of his mind like an unresolved chord. He could feel the contours of a life remaking itself, not by spectacle, but by steady, stubborn care. In the mornings to come there would be meetings and more paperwork, calls with Samuel about legal prudence, and conversations with community leaders about how to spend funds without losing sight of Arthur's intentions. There would be whispers and thinly veiled threats from those whose pride had teeth. There would also be the slow work of truth, and the patient rebuilding of trust in a neighborhood that had been taught to settle for less. And someplace on the periphery of his days, Vanessa's frozen posture in the doorway would keep returning to him, a small index of the moment she saw what she had given up. He did not know how she would make of it later, whether she would try to explain herself, to ask forgiveness, or to watch from a distance. But he knew this. The choice she had made once would not be the only measure of their lives. There were other measures now, and they had nothing to do with her approval. He closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer. The manila cover lay under a lamp as he read a grant application one more time. He let out a breath that sounded a little like prayer and a little like planning. Outside, life continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside, he had decided to create something that could not be stolen by mockery. And in that fragile certainty lay the first true comfort he had known since the corridor. If anything happened next, it would be with intention, not reactivity. If you were him, yes, would you forgive? Tell us below, and subscribe to follow what happens next. The next morning began like the last, ordinary in its small mercies. Jamal woke before the child, making coffee with the same mug that had a chip at the lip. The apartment smelled of boiled oatmeal and the clean linen that had been draped over a chair to dry. He drove to the small rented room that had become the first classroom and unlocked the door, the key cool in his palm. The walls were the kind of neutral that lets things put on their own colors. Flyers for ESL, a poster for after-school chess, a faded print of a child with a globe. The pilot program grew because people who lived at the edge of the map kept showing up. Parents came with questions about childcare subsidies and small jobs that would pay for a month's groceries. Teenagers who had dropped classes for shifts in the deli asked about tutoring. A young mother named Lisette wanted to enroll her boy in the reading group, but could only commit nights. Jamal rearranged schedules so she could work during the day without losing the seat they'd promised him. The first checks Jamal wrote were small and precise. A refrigerator coil repaired for an elderly volunteer so she could keep cooking for the after-school snacks. Bus passes for 3 high schoolers whose mentors couldn't otherwise get them to campus. A $100 grant to a father who needed a permit for a food cart that would allow him to double his income. People noticed in quiet ways. A teacher sent a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you. You keep our kids fed for the future." A principal from across town dropped off a box of surplus textbooks. Ms. Rosa, who had run the community center for 20 years on a shoestring, brought jars of jam and the kind of institutional knowledge that is worth more than a ledger full of numbers. Jamal established a small board to steward the funds Arthur had entrusted to him. He insisted on diversity and competence over spectacle. Ms. Rosa sat in one seat. Daniel Boone took another. Jamal asked his college professor, a thoughtful woman named Lena Park, who had an eye for budgets, to manage the books. They debated modest policies for grant applications, transparency, and conflict of interest, until the paperwork looked like armor, sturdy, boring, and necessary. They named the organization the Harris Community Initiative. There was no marble plaque announcing Jamal's name. There was instead a tiny wooden placard near the coat rack with the motto Arthur had scrawled in a notebook: "Teach them to see themselves." The work was steady and slow and not always pretty. Grants were denied, and Jamal learned to write again, to shape sentences that could open doors. People argued about priorities. A heated discussion once erupted over whether to buy new classroom chairs or pay for a part-time counselor. Jamal learned to listen more than he spoke. As the initiative found its rhythm, the recordings remained folded and grim in the drawer. The thought of them had the persistent weight of unfinished business, a possible justice waiting in the wings. Once, after a particularly raw phone call from someone on the board who worried about stirring up the family's lawyers, Jamal sat with the folder in his lap and felt the small baby glow of fury flare and then go out. He had not become what he despised. He had learned to let time do the heavy work Arthur had talked about. Patience invested like compound interest. Not everyone was content to let patience be his answer. The Whitmores, smarting and restless, tried subtle pressure first. There were notes from their attorneys that read like an old script, polite threats thinly veiled as concern for a reputation. There were wealthy friends who forwarded messages implying that a man in his position would be unwise to upset the people who hold the purse strings. The family's social circle whispered, a long, dry rustle that reached the edges of the neighborhood. Then, faintly at first and louder as months went by, a different current arrived, one Jamal had not expected, but that was suddenly useful. A reporter from the local paper, Evelyn Brooks, called to ask about an anonymous tip. She had the kind of voice that sounded like she had already sifted through more than she should have and found detail enough to be dangerous. She asked if Jamal would be willing to meet. She said the tipster had hinted at a pattern in the Whitmore family's charitable activities and business dealings. The paper had started to find threads that suggested more than image polishing. Jamal thought of the manila folder and the recordings. He thought of keeping them private in case a nest of wrongdoing needed to be opened gently, not smashed. He met Evelyn at a small cafe, her notebook thin and a half-empty tea cooling by her hand. "I don't want anything that will harm your work," she said carefully. "But people deserve to know if a family is using philanthropic fronts to hide other things. We've found odd transfers, layers of companies with names like Arbor Holdings, and some trusts that link to property holdings in other states. None of it proves anything on its own, but together." She made a face like someone putting tiny pieces of a puzzle into place. "It's worth a look." Jamal listened and thought of the baby's future. He authorized Evelyn to look through a limited set of the documents and agreed, with Samuel's counsel present, to turn over copies of the audio files. not as spectacle, but as corroboration if needed. He insisted on redaction where necessary to protect innocence. He insisted the reporting include the family's response. The newspaper ran a modest piece 6 weeks later, a careful article that used words like alleged irregularities and ongoing review. It named no crimes but raised questions. It described how certain donations to foundations appeared to have been reallocated, how invoices had odd numerations, how grants had been awarded to shell entities later dissolved. The Whitmores issued a statement about privacy and dignity. The public, once lured into curiosity, began to ask louder questions. For Jamal, this was a moment of moral calculus. He watched as the Whitmores scrambled, spinning narratives of misunderstanding and presenting glossy philanthropic statements in an attempt to reclaim control. The family's defenders argued that complex estates looked messy to outsiders. The paper published a follow-up that showed more records, more connections, and it quoted an independent auditor who said the pattern merited a regulatory glance. A regulatory glance came. State authorities opened a preliminary inquiry into financial practices related to the Whitmore family foundations and affiliated businesses. Investigators asked for documents, subpoenaed bank records from shell entities, and slowly, like a tide, began to bring hidden things to the light. Samuel, careful and conservative, helped Jamal respond in ways that protected the initiative and the child, while cooperating with the inquiry. "We proceed as if truth is our shield," Samuel told Jamal. "If there is malfeasance, we let those facts stand up without making them a personal spectacle." The Whitmores pushed back. They called lawyers, launched a PR campaign, and tried to paint Jamal as someone who had been seduced by money. There were social media posts with photos of opulent events, whose captions suggested a generosity that apparently absolved any misstep. There was a moment when a friend of Vanessa's sent Jamal an unkind message that accused him of betrayal. But the community that benefited daily from the initiative wrote letters, called the paper, and showed up at town meetings to vouch for the real, untidy change Jamal's funding had created. That public proof was both humble and powerful. Attendance lists, children's artwork, bus passes, receipts for tuition paid. As investigators sifted through ledgers, more people connected by small grievances began to speak. An employee from a contracting firm confirmed a questionable invoice. A former fundraiser disclosed a phantom payment that had been redirected. Each new confirmation was presented cautiously by authorities, always with the phrase, alleged irregularities, until a fuller filing could be made. The Whitmores' wealth, once an unassailable shell, began to feel brittle under scrutiny. Vanessa, whose life had been braided with that family's social ascent, found herself in a narrower orbit. She had married, not into a castle but into the quiet obligations that came with being close to money. The marriage, whatever its initial comfort, held tensions she had not anticipated. Her voice, once practiced in the art of slipping into a room unnoticed, became smaller. There were rumors about her leaving dinners early, about a restless sleep that kept her from morning calls. Sometimes she would drive past the community center and slow, then speed up, as if fear and curiosity warred in her chest. Her own conscience tightened into a slow ache. She began volunteering at a small clinic under a different name, delivering paperwork and folding envelopes in the early mornings when fewer people noticed. Once, in a hallway, she nearly backed into Ms. Rosa, who looked at her with an expression that was not cruelty, but calculation. Vanessa tried to speak. "Ms." Rosa's voice was flat and kind. "We have openings for volunteers," she said. "We need help distributing lunches on Fridays." Vanessa's eyes filled and she said, "I'd like to." She signed the sheet with a hand that shook. When the investigations moved closer to the public square, the Whitmores responded as a family used to being in control. They tightened statements and hired counsel who specialized in taking heat off names. Derek, adolescent heir of a local board, resigned from several public positions. Harlan retreated into a quieter life. People who had once curved around their table now measured their invitations. The family's social calendar shrank. Through it all, Jamal refused to make his life a stage for personal vengeance. He had seen what spectacle did. It became a festering wound that the crowd licked at, feeling powerful by witnessing the downfall of someone they had once envied. Instead, Jamal set up grant committees that listened to the neighborhood rather than telling it what it needed. He worked with the public schools to create after-school programs that dovetailed with existing curricula. He hired a modest staff from within the community, people who had once been beneficiaries themselves and were now leaders shaping the next generation. As the years passed, the initiative carved out real structures. The pilot classroom expanded into a permanent location, a refurbished storefront with windows that let light in, and a room where children could spread paper and not worry about spills. They opened a childcare wing that operated on sliding scales and offered parents evening shifts so that work schedules could intersect with care. They created the Harris Scholars Fund for kids who needed tuition assistance for community college. Small victories piled up. A first student to graduate from community college and then transfer to a 4-year school. A parent who launched a catering business from a kitchen the initiative helped equip. A teen who found a trade apprenticeship, thanks to a connection Jamal made at a town hall meeting. These outcomes mattered because they were durable. Jamal watched 2 children, twins from a nearby block, go from crayons to algebra with the same teacher. He spoke at a small graduation ceremony and watched a mother cry in the front row, not from spectacle but from relief. His name rarely appeared in print. The plaque on the building bore only the initiative's name. He liked it that way. The work was louder than the man who paid for it. 10 years unrolled like a ribbon. The child Jamal once carried in a pink blanket grew into a person of her own making, quick-witted, steady-handed, and known to everyone as Maya. She learned to make coffee for volunteers before school, to listen to kids with the patience of someone who had spent years being listened to. Jamal watched her with the humility of a man who had been given time to do right. There was no expensive remodeling to decorate his life, no daily parade of status. His modest home was full of practical things: a stack of library books, a second-hand bicycle that needed oiling, a frame with a photograph of the first day the tutoring room opened. Maya, small in a hoodie, beaming. The Harris Community Initiative matured as well. They raised funds not from ostentation but from many small donors and a few sustained partnerships with local businesses. Reports were public, audits were posted. Lena Park, the CFO, kept the accounts open like a window. There was pride in that transparency, in letting the community see the plumbing that made their services run. The Whitmore family endured a quiet, public unraveling. Investigators found evidence suggesting some donations had been used in ways that did not align with stated charitable purposes. Authorities froze certain accounts as inquiries proceeded. The family's businesses reeled as clients distanced themselves. Court filings, made in fictionally consistent terms for the purpose of this story, suggested civil suits alleging misdirection of funds. The word alleged rested like a legal cushion in every report. The public discourse shifted. Where once the Whitmores had been able to dictate taste, people began to ask new questions about who benefits from a philanthropy that also boosts reputation. The narrative, which had once been about the family's generosity, now had new layers. About governance, about accountability, about whom the system had favored, and how. Vanessa's life did not reconnect neatly with fame or fortune. She left the social orbit that had seemed hospitable and was left with the rawness of the choices she had made. She and Derek separated quietly. The divorce was a hush, both in court and in the gossip columns. Vanessa moved into a small apartment above a bakery and worked in a clinic during the day. She volunteered at the initiative for a while, delivering sandwiches and folding napkins in anonymous shifts. Ms. Rosa, who had the long memory of someone who had seen many things, watched Vanessa and sometimes gave curt nods of permission. In the years that followed, Vanessa tried to rebuild a life that wasn't built on performance. She took a course in counseling and began to work part-time with families dealing with housing instability. She wrote letters, many of them never sent, to Jamal, first in apology and then in attempts to explain. He read none and filed none away. He had learned that his own center had to be guarded. He had learned to let others decide how much they wanted to carry of their past. Then, a decade from the corridor and the pink blanket, the town organized a ribbon cutting for the Harris Community Center's new wing. A modest but significant expansion that added 2 classrooms, a full-time counselor's office, and a community kitchen. The press release called it a celebration of community-led resilience. Parents posted flyers. The mayor planned a short speech. Jamal agreed to give a few words. The day was bright and mild. The center smelled of paint and fresh coffee. Volunteers moved chairs into neat rows, and a small brass ribbon waited for scissors. Maya stood near her father, taller now, with a crooked smile and a stack of art she'd collected from kids over the years. Children were stirred into a low hum of excitement. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes before the ceremony. She had learned through years of small courage how to admit things with steps rather than statements. She wore a simple coat and had tied her hair back in a way that made her face open rather than hide. She paused at the gate and then, with a hand that trembled and steadied, stepped inside. For a heartbeat, the world went narrow. Vanessa stopped at the back of the small crowd and looked toward the table where Jamal stood. He had not changed in any readable way. His hair had some gray near the temples. His hands bore the calluses of a life of doing rather than being served. He wore a plain shirt and a jacket he'd owned for years. He looked out across the room at the faces, children, parents, teachers, and there was a kind of quiet authority in his stance that had not existed a decade before. It was not the authority of money, but of someone whose yes and no had been tested and who now wielded them with care. When Vanessa's eyes found him, her face went still. She had come to offer help, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to seek forgiveness. Instead, she froze, not out of fear of the cameras or the law, but because she could not reconcile the young man she had left in a corridor with the figure now holding the room's attention. Her feet felt like stones. Memory, regret, and recognition collided inside her like weather. For a long second, she did not move. Jamal's speech was simple. He talked about small investments and long patience. He thanked people who had shown up for kids whose lives had been discounted for too long. He asked not for gratitude for himself, but for sustained attention to community needs. Maya sat beside him and offered a quiet clap when he mentioned the first scholarship recipient. The children cheered at that name. The crowd felt palpably like something that was not manufactured but earned, knitted together by work that did not look for praise. After the scissors cut the ribbon and the applause washed around the room, people streamed inside to tour the new classrooms. Vanessa lingered at the back, watching as parents introduced themselves to Jamal and as kids tumbled into the new space and claimed nooks for their art. She saw a mother she recognized from the rows of the clinic laugh openly with Jamal as they spoke about local bus routes. She watched Maya lead a small group to the kitchen and demonstrate how to use a can opener like a small ritual. Her chest unclenched a little at the sight. There was life here, and it had not been crafted for spectacle but for purpose. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Jamal packed away the ribbon and the extra chairs with the team and started to come toward the exit. Vanessa stood near the doorway, her hands together as if holding herself upright. When their eyes met again, the room seemed to hush. She made a small movement as if to step forward. Jamal, who had rehearsed nothing, did not move to meet her with outstretched arms nor to slam a door. Instead, he folded his hands and waited with the steadiness he had taught himself to wear. "Jamal," she said, and the name was a small, fragile thing. He nodded. "Vanessa." She found a chair and sat in it like someone trying on a truth. The city noises outside were faint, like a breathing thing. For a short while, their conversation was the sort of exchange two people who have lived in parallel lines have. Apologies, acknowledgments, the thin admissions of a life that had been complicated. "I wanted to say thank you," Vanessa began, voice small. "I didn't know. I didn't see." She looked down at her hands. "I was scared to face what I had been part of. I'm sorry for walking away that day. I thought I was doing the right thing for myself." Jamal listened. He did not interrupt. He had the patience of a man who had learned to measure his words like coins to be used well. "You don't have to say anything," Vanessa continued. I don't even know what I expect." There was something in her voice that wanted absolution and also was resigned to not receiving it. Jamal thought of the recordings, of all the rehearsed cruelty they contained, and he felt briefly the ancient heat of a wound. But he also saw the queue of parents waiting to sign children up for the new afternoon program. the volunteers who would now have a place to leave coats and take rest, the small parade of benefits that multiplied when people invested in others' lives. "I remember what Arthur told me," Jamal said softly, invoking the man who had been the architect of this strange, patient fortune. He said, "Build a place they cannot buy and cannot mock." That's what we tried to do. Vanessa's eyes moved to the plaque. She swallowed. You didn't make it about him," she said. "You made it about them." Jamal nodded. "I could have made this a stage," he said. "I could have made them pay every day in front of everyone. But it would only be more hurt. I decided to build doors." There was a pause. Vanessa's shoulders shook once, a small involuntary motion that felt like the last concession of someone learning humility. "I lost a lot when I left," she said. "I thought I had everything, but I was wrong." "That isn't my measure of you," Jamal replied. He did not offer an embrace. He extended instead something practical and gentle. "If you want to help, really help, we have a volunteer opening on Fridays. We need someone to coordinate parent intake. It's not glamorous, it's honesty. If you can commit to that, you can start." Vanessa's mouth opened. For a moment, hope and shame crossed like a pair of birds. She lowered her head and then finally met his eyes. "I'd like that," she said. "If you'll have me." Jamal considered the request as if weighing a simple fact. "You'll have to work for it," he said. "We don't forgive on command. We check if people are willing to stay when it's hard. If you can do that, you're welcome." Vanessa exhaled a breath that was almost a laugh. "I can do that." They did not hug then. Instead, they sat together and watched a line of kids file through the classroom and claim desks full of crayons. The conversation that followed was less about confession and more about the work at hand: schedules, trainings, boundaries. It was practical and honest and in its own way the closest thing to reconciliation that mattered to Jamal. He did not ask her to explain everything. He asked her to show up and be consistent. To him, that was both repentance and labor. Outside, the town continued to ask difficult questions about accountability. The Whitmores reacted to inquiries with lawyers and statements. Some members made gestures toward reparative gestures. The state's inquiries remained formally open, with authorities indicating that investigations were ongoing into certain charitable transactions. The phrase, "alleged irregularities," hovered in news reports as a legal cushion for a story still unfolding. In the midst of those headlines, Jamal and his team turned their attention back to the children, their names lingering like constellations that never quite disappeared. Years after the ribbon cutting, the Harris Scholars Program sent its first cohort of students to four-year colleges with community endorsements and living stipends to support their first year. A single mother who had been a regular at the toddler program opened a childcare co-op that employed local women. A young man named Leon, once a kid who had shown up with a knapsack and no plan, completed a welding apprenticeship and now taught classes at the center. When the press would occasionally ask Jamal about the Whitmores, he answered with a steady, focused kindness. "We let the facts follow their path," he would say. "If there is harm that needs redress, we let the authorities do their work. My job is to build places where people are seen and helped." The press learned quickly that he was not interested in spectacle. Vanessa stayed. She worked the Friday intake desk and listened with a careful attention she had not known she possessed. Families who once would have been turned away by layers of paperwork found in her a straightforward humanity. She learned the impact of small gestures, a phone call that secured a bus pass, a warm meal at the end of a long night. She apologized in small ways and, more importantly, remained where apologies are tested, in the nitty detail of service. From the outside it might have looked like redemption. From the inside it felt like long, necessary repair. People who had been harmed by the Whitmores' alleged misappropriations filed suits. The legal process took its slow turns. Notices in court dockets, depositions, and motions filled law offices and reviewers' calendars. Some family members faced civil claims, some faced public censure. The public conversation became more about systems than personalities, about how wealth can sometimes camouflage misconduct, and how communities can insist on transparency in their philanthropy. Jamal stayed focused on the immediate work of care, letting law walk its pace. Time, which had felt so heavy in that corridor, had altered everyone. Harlan Whitmore passed into a quiet retirement. His name, once a garnish for every invitation, appeared less and less. Derek kept a low profile and eventually moved out of public boards. The family's estates were reorganized under scrutiny. The community watched as the bright sheen of the family's old image dulled under the grime of disclosure. Some of their old allies stepped back. The Whitmores' reputation, once a moat, became a subject of debate at book clubs and PTA meetings. Through it all, Jamal kept the small rituals that had sustained him: reading to Maya before bed, taking a walk through the neighborhood on Sundays, leaning into a friend's quiet counsel when the noise of public life overloaded him. He remained a man who wore his past like a map, visible enough to be instructive but not so loud as to become the center. On a late autumn afternoon, Jamal received a letter from an elder in the neighborhood who had watched the center grow. The note was simple: "You made the kind of wealth that lasts." He folded it twice, placed it in the pocket of his jacket, and then without fanfare gave it to Lena Park so she could add it to the modest collection of testimonials the initiative kept for donors. 10 years from the corridor, the image that had once felt like a scar, Vanessa's shoulders turning away, the baby at Jamal's chest, had been reframed not by revenge but by a steady counter. Hundreds of children who had safe seats, a small staff that paid rent, and a neighborhood that answered when given the tools to do so. Jamal's life had not been made flawless by money. There were moments of doubt, administrative headaches, and days when the checking account required creative calculations. There were still whispered insults in certain social corners, people who delighted in what they called his newfound pretensions. He heard them on occasion, and allowed the sound to move through him without lodging. Maya grew into someone whose presence was both fierce and kind. At family nights, she would help kids with long division, and then sit with a parent who needed to fill out a college application. Jamal watched her teach children how to hold a pencil just right to form letters, and he felt a quiet gratitude that had the slow warmth of good coffee.
He saw the arc his life had taken and recognized there the hum of something like grace, not magic, but the patient algebra of small acts multiplied by time. When people asked Jamal what he would have done differently, he often replied, "I might have learned sooner to let kindness be my first weapon." He would sometimes add, because it felt honest, "But I would not change Arthur. He taught me to invest in people the way others invest in vaults."
Vanessa never again occupied the center of Jamal's life. She became instead a person who worked in the background, who showed up on time, and who had to live with the knowledge of what she had helped make possible and what she had once walked away from. She visited the center on days the weather was bad, bringing soup for the volunteers and leaving without ceremony. Once, when a parent she had helped hugged her in gratitude for a bus pass, she cried openly and did not flinch. It was a small, honest thing. At times, on quiet nights, Jamal would still think of the manila folder in his drawer, the recordings like a slow drumbeat. He kept them because their testimony had served a purpose, to protect others from patterns that might repeat. He kept them because records are sometimes the best form of care for people who have not yet been heard. But he rarely opened the drawer. The work he had chosen, the long building of a place where dignity could be practiced, had become the only way he knew to honor the choices he had kept. On the 10th anniversary of the corridor, Jamal stood in a room where children were drawing, and he felt the full weight of a decade like a hand that steadied his shoulder. He thought of the first mornings when his hands were raw from work and his heart raw from loss. He thought of Arthur's quiet savings, and the old man's insistence that time would be the heavy lifter. He watched Maya tie a bandana around a little boy's forehead like a cape, and laugh as the child declared himself a superhero. Jamal smiled and felt at last that the life he had been building was more honest than the one he had once craved. Outside, news coverage mentioned yet another cycle of inquiry around the Whitmore foundations, reporting that regulators had imposed fines in certain cases and ordered restitution to be considered. The phrasing remained careful. The reports used allegations and findings with the precision of legal caution. The family's name remained attached to headlines and to court filings, but in the neighborhood their presence had become a story of what happens when wealth is stewarded without accountability. The town's conversation had shifted. Once the Whitmore's parties set the cultural tempo, now community centers set it. At the center, Jamal gave a short speech about stewardship, not the stewardship of bank accounts, but the stewardship of opportunity. He thanked the people who had shown up for the work, thanked Maya for her relentless kindness, and honored the many hands that had built spaces for others to rise. He did not mention the corridor except once, in passing, to say that small cruelties did not write the final chapters of people's lives. Later, when the last of the guests had left and the fluorescent lights hummed down to a faithful dim, Jamal sat on the threshold of the room with a cup of cheap coffee and watched a child fix the kite they had made. He thought about the 10 years and the choices that had made them possible. The small city noises rose and fell like a tide. He had been abandoned with a baby in a corridor and had been mocked in rooms where lacquered tables made small cruelties easy. He had been offered a fortune that could have bought 1,000 wants, and he had chosen to let it buy something steady and patient instead. The choice had not been easy. There were nights when he had entertained the intoxicating taste of retaliation. But in the end, the life he had built, classrooms, scholarships, a kitchen where women could share bigger portions of themselves, felt like the kind of wealth that could not be mocked. When people asked him what he had learned, he would say, "Wealth is the liberty to care, not an invitation to be cruel. The real test is what you choose to do with the power you are given." In the quiet of that night, as the kite tugged and the child's laugh skittered like a light, Jamal thought of Arthur's scratch notebooks, of the scratch of a pencil marking a plan on an old table. He smiled and breathed in the small, deliberate air of someone who had made a life out of patient decisions. Vanessa, someplace modest and mending, slept and woke and lived with the smallness of good deeds and the difficulty of atonement. She had frozen once upon seeing what she had abandoned. That moment, for her, was a doorway rather than a reckoning. She chose, in the years after, to step through and work in a room where children could be seen rather than held at a distance. She was not forgiven with a single word. She earned the trust of the community slowly, and sometimes she failed and asked to try again. For her, the freeze in the doorway had become a pivot. The story that had begun with a corridor and an abandoned infant had wandered into a life that was not a triumph in the tabloid sense, but was a sustained, stubborn rebuilding. Jamal kept what dignity he had once been denied. He used what fortune had been entrusted to him to open doors, to fund teachers, to repair refrigerators, to pay bus passes and tuition and emergency rent. He refused to turn the recordings into a sword aimed at vanity. Instead, he used them when necessary as a shield for others. And when people would ask later what justice looked like, many would point to the center where children colored the world unafraid. They would point to scholarships and to mothers whose lives had stabilized. They would point to a man who had been left in a corridor and who chose, decade after decade, to build something that could not be bought or mocked away. If you were him, would you forgive? Tell us below.